"Witches," said Lord Felmet. "Witches," said the Duchess. In the draughty corridors, a voice as faint as the wind in a distant keyhole said, with a note of hope, "Witches!" The psychically inclined, so forth. "It's meddling, that's what it is," said Granny Weatherwax, "and no good will come of it." "It's very romantic," said Margaret breathily, and heaved a sigh. "Gucci goo," said Nanny Hogg. "Anyway," said Margaret, "you killed that horrid man." "I never did. I just encouraged things to take their course." Granny Weatherwax frowned. "He didn't have no respect. Once people lose their respect, it means trouble." "Easy wizzy wuzzy then." "That other man brought him out here to save him," shouted Margaret. "He wanted us to keep him safe. It's obvious. It's destiny." "Oh, obvious," said Granny. "I'll grant you it's obvious. Trouble is, just because things are obvious doesn't mean they're true." She weighed the crown in her hands. It felt very heavy, in a way that went beyond mere pounds and ounces. "Yes, but the point is," Margaret began. "The point is," said Granny, "that people are going to come looking. Serious people. Serious looking, pull down the walls and burn off the thatch looking. And how's a boy then? And, Githa, I'm sure we'll all be a lot happier if you'd stop gurgling like that," Granny snapped. She could feel her nerves coming on. Her nerves always played up when she was unsure about things. Besides, they had retired to Margaret's cottage, and the decor was getting to her, because Margaret believed in nature's wisdom and elves and healing power of colours and the cycle of seasons and a lot of things Granny Weatherwax didn't have any truck with. "You're not telling me how to look after a child," snapped Nanny Ogg mildly. "And me with 15 of my own?" "I'm just saying that we ought to think about it," said Granny. The other two watched her for some time. "Well," said Margaret. Granny's fingers drummed on the edge of the crown. She frowned. "First, we've got to take him away from here," she said, and held up a hand. "No, Githa, I'm sure your cottage is ideal and everything, but it's not safe. He's got to be somewhere away from here, a long way away, where no one knows who he is, and then there's this." She tossed the crown from hand to hand. "But that's easy," said Margaret. "I mean, you just hide it under a stone or something." "That's easy, much easier than babies." "It ain't," said Granny. "The reason being, the country's full of babies, and they all look the same, but I don't reckon there's many crowns. They have this way of being found anyway. They kind of call out to people's minds. If you bunged it under a stone up there, in a week's time it'd get itself discovered by accident. You mark my words." "It's true, is that?" said Nanny Ogg earnestly. "How many times have you thrown a magic ring into the deepest depths of the ocean, and then, when you get home and have a nice bit of turbot for your tea, there it is?" They considered this in silence. "Never," said Granny irritably, "and nor have you. Anyway, he might want it back, and if it's rightfully his, that is. Kings set a lot of store by crowns. Really, Githa, sometimes you say the most—" "I'll just make some tea, shall I?" said Margaret brightly, and disappeared into the scullery. The two elderly witches sat on either side of the table in polite, prickly silence. Finally, Nanny Ogg said, "She done it up nice, hasn't she? Flowers and everything. What are them things on the walls?" "Sigils," said Granny sourly, or some such. "Fancy," said Nanny Ogg politely. "And all them robes and wands and things too." "Modern," said Granny Weatherwax with a sniff. "When I was a gal, we had a lump of wax and a couple of pins and had to be content. We had to make our own enchantment in them days." "Oh, well, we've all passed a lot of water since then," said Nanny Ogg sagely. She gave the baby a comforting jiggle. Granny Weatherwax sniffed. Nanny Ogg had been married 3 times and ruled a tribe of children and grandchildren all over the kingdom. Certainly it was not actually forbidden for witches to get married. Granny had to concede that, but reluctantly, very reluctantly, she sniffed again, disapprovingly. This was a mistake. "What's that smell?" she snapped. "Ah," said Nanny Og, carefully repositioning the baby. I'll just go and see if Margaret has any clean rags, shall I?" And now Granny was left alone. She felt embarrassed, as one always does when left alone in someone else's room, and fought the urge to get up and inspect the books on the shelf over the sideboard, or examine the mantelpiece for dust. She turned the crown round and round in her hands. Again it gave the impression of being bigger and heavier than it actually was. She caught sight of the mirror over the mantelpiece and looked down at the crown. It was tempting. It was practically begging her to try it for herself. Well, and why not? She made sure that the others weren't around then, and then, in one movement, whipped off her hat and placed the crown on her head. It seemed to fit. Granny drew herself up proudly and waved a hand imperiously in the general direction of the hearth. "Jolly well do this," she said. She beckoned arrogantly at the grandfather clock. "Chop his head off, what ho!" she commanded. She smiled grimly, and froze as she heard the screams, and the thunder of horses, and the deadly whisper of arrows, and the damp, solid sound of spears and flesh. Charge after charge echoed across her skull. Sword met shield, or sword or bone, relentlessly. Years streamed across her mind in the space of a second. There were times when she lay among the dead, or hanging from the branch of a tree, but always there were hands that would pick her up again and place her on a velvet cushion. Granny very carefully lifted the crown off her head. It was an effort. It didn't like it much, and laid it on the table. "So that's being a king for you, is it?" she said softly. "I wonder why they all want the job." "Do you take sugar?" said Margaret behind her. "You'd have to be born a fool to be a king," said Granny. "Sorry?" Granny turned. "Didn't see you come in," she said. "What was it you said? Sugar in your tea?" "3 spoons, said Granny promptly. It was one of the few sorrows of Granny Weatherwax's life that, despite all her effort, she'd arrived at the peak of her career with a complexion like a rosy apple and all her teeth. No amount of charms could persuade a wart to take root on her handsome, if slightly equine features, and vast intakes of sugar only served to give her boundless energy. A wizard she'd consulted had explained it was on account of her having a metabolism which at least allowed her to feel vaguely superior to Nanny Og, who she suspected had never even seen one. Margaret dutifully dug out 3 heaped ones. It would be nice, she thought wistfully, if someone could say thank you occasionally. She became aware the crown was staring at her. "You can feel it, can you?" said Granny. "I said, didn't I? Crowns call out. It's horrible." No, it's just being what it is. It can't help it." "But it's magic!" "It's just being what it is," Granny repeated. "It's trying to get me to try it on," said Margaret, her hand hovering. "It does that, yes." "But I shall be strong," said Margaret. "So I should think," said Granny, her expression suddenly curiously wooden. "What's Githa doing?" "She's giving the baby a wash in the sink," said Margaret vaguely. "How can we hide something like this? What'd happen if we buried it really deeply somewhere?" "A badger'd dig it up," said Granny warily, "or someone'd go prospecting for gold, or something. Or tree'd tangle its root around it and then be blown over in a storm, and then someone'd pick it up and put it on. Unless they were as strong-minded as us," Margaret pointed out. "Unless that, of course," said Granny, staring at her fingernails. "Though the thing with crowns is, it isn't the putting them on that's the problem, it's the taking them off." Margaret picked it up and turned it over and over in her hands. "It's not as though it even looks much like a crown," she said. "You've seen a lot, I expect," said Granny. "You'd be an expert on them naturally." "Seen a fair few. Got a lot more jewels on them, and cloth bits in the middle," said Margaret defiantly. "This is just a thin little thing." "Margaret Garlic! I have, when I was being trained up by Goody Whemper, may she rest in peace, she used to take me over to Razorback or into Longcrow whenever the strolling players were in town. She was very keen on the theatre. They've got more crowns than you can shake a stick at, although, mind," she paused, "Goody did say they're made of tin and paper and stuff, and just glass for the jewels. They look more realer than this one. Do you think that's strange?" "Things that try to look like things often do look more like things than things." "Well-known fact," said Granny, "but I don't hold with encouraging it." "What do they stroll about playing, then, in these crowns?" "You don't know about the theatre?" said Margaret. Granny Weatherwax, who had never declared her ignorance of anything, didn't hesitate. "Oh, yes," she said. "It's one of them style of things, then, is it?" "Goody Wemper said it held a mirror up to life," said Margaret. "She said it always cheered her up." "I expect it would," said Granny, striking out. "Played properly, at any rate. Good people, are they, these theatre players?" "I think so." "And they stroll around the country, you say?" said Granny thoughtfully, looking towards the scullery door. "All over the place. There's a troupe in Lancre now, I heard. I haven't been because, Margaret looked down. "It's not right, a woman going to such places by herself." Granny nodded. She thoroughly approved of such sentiments so long as there was, of course, no suggestion that they applied to her. She drummed her fingers on Margaret's tablecloth. "Right," she said, "and why not? Go and tell Githa to wrap the baby up well. It's a long time since I heard a theatre play did properly." Margaret was entranced, as usual. The theatre was no more than some lengths of painted sacking, a plank stage laid over a few barrels, and half a dozen benches set out in the village square. But at the same time, it had also managed to become the castle, another part of the castle, the same part a little later, the battlefield, and now it was a road outside the city. The afternoon would have been perfect if it wasn't for Granny Weatherwax. After several piercing glares at the three-man orchestra to see if she could work out which instrument the theatre was, the old witch had finally paid attention to the stage, and it was beginning to become apparent to Margaret that there were certain fundamental aspects of the theatre that Granny had not yet grasped. She was currently bouncing up and down on a stool with rage. "He's killed him," she hissed. "Why isn't anyone doing anything about it? He's killed him, and right up in front of everyone." Margaret held on desperately to her colleague's arm as she struggled to get to her feet. "It's all right," she whispered. "He's not dead." "Are you calling me a liar, my girl?" snapped Granny. "I saw it all." "Look, Granny, it's not really real, do you see?" Granny Weatherwax subsided a little, but still grumbled under her breath. She was beginning to feel that things were trying to make a fool of her. Up on the stage, a man in a sheet was giving a spirited monologue. Granny listened intently for some minutes, and then nudged Margaret in the ribs. "What's he on about now?" she demanded. "He's saying how sorry he was that the other man's dead," said Margaret, and in an attempt to change the subject added hurriedly, "There's a lot of crowns, isn't there?" Granny was not to be distracted. "Where'd he go and kill him for, then?" she said. "Well, it's a bit complicated," said Margaret weakly. "It's shameful," snapped Granny. "And the poor dead thing's still lying there." Margaret gave an imploring look to Nanny Ogg, who was masticating an apple and studying the stage with the glare of research scientist. "I reckon," she said lowly, "I reckon it's all just pretending. Look, he's still breathing." The rest of the audience, who by now had already decided that this commentary was all part of the play, stared as one man at the corpse. It blushed. "And look at his boots, too," said Nanny critically. "A real king'd be ashamed of boots like that." The corpse tried to shuffle its feet behind a cardboard bush. Granny, feeling in some obscure way that they had scored a minor triumph over the purveyors of untruth and artifice, helped herself to an apple from the bag and began to take a fresh interest. Margaret's nerves were beginning to unknot, and she began to settle down to enjoy the play. But not, as it turned out, for very long. Her willing suspension of disbelief was interrupted by a voice saying, "What's this bit?" Margaret sighed. "Well," she hazarded, "he thinks that he is the prince, but he's really the other king's daughter dressed up as a man." Granny subjected the actor to a long analytical stare. "He is a man," she said, "in a straw wig, making his voice squeaky." Margaret shuddered. She knew a little about the conventions of the theatre. She had been dreading this bit. Granny Weatherwax had views. Yes, but, she said wretchedly, it's the theatre, see? All women are played by men. Why? They don't allow no women on the stage, said Margaret in a small voice. She shut her eyes. In fact, there was no outburst from the seat on her left. She risked a quick glance. Granny was quietly chewing the same bit of apple over and over again, her eyes never leaving the action. Don't make a fuss, Esme, said Nanny, who also knew about Granny's views. This is a good bit, I reckon. I'm getting the hang of it. Someone tapped Granny on the shoulder, and a voice said, Madam, will you kindly remove your hat? Granny turned around and very slowly, on her stool, as though propelled by hidden motors, and subjected the interrupter to 100-kilowatt diamond blue stare. The man wilted under it and sagged back onto his stool, her face following him all the way down. No, she said. He considered the options. All right, he said. Granny turned back and nodded to the actors who had paused to watch her. I don't know what you're staring at, she growled. Get on with it. Nanny Og passed her another bag. Have a humbug, she said. Silence again filled the makeshift theatre, except for the hesitant voices of the actors who kept glancing at the bristling figure of Granny Weatherwax and the sucking sounds of a couple of boiled humbugs being relentlessly churned from cheek to cheek. Then Granny said in a piercing voice that made one actor drop his wooden sword, There's a man over on the side, they're whispering to them. He's a prompter, said Margaret. He tells them what to say. Don't they know? I think they're forgetting, said Margaret sourly, for some reason. Granny nudged Nanny Og. What's going on now? She said. Why are all them kings and people up there? It's a banquet, see? Said Nanny Og authoritatively. Because of the dead king, him and the boots as was. Only now if you look, you'll see he's pretending to be a soldier, and everyone's making speeches about how good he was, and wondering who killed him. Are they? Said Granny grimly. She cast her eyes along the cast, looking for the murderer. She was making up her mind. Then she stood up. A black shawl billowed around her like the wings of an avenging angel come to rid the world of all that foolishness and pretense and artifice and sham. She seemed somehow a lot bigger than normal. She pointed an angry finger at the guilty party. He's done it, she shouted triumphantly. We all seed him. He done it with a dagger. The audience filed out, contented. It had been a good play on the whole, they decided, although not very easy to follow, but it had been a jolly good laugh when all the kings had run off, and the woman in the black had jumped up and did all the shouting. That alone had been well worth the halfpenny admission. The three witches sat alone on the edge of the stage. I wonder how they get all them kings and lords to come here to do this, said Granny, totally unabashed. I'd have thought they'd been too busy ruling and similar. No, said Margaret wearily. I still don't think you quite understand. Well, I'm going to get to the bottom of it, snapped Granny. She got back onto the stage and pulled aside the sacking curtains. You, she shouted, you're dead! The luckless former corpse who was eating a ham sandwich to calm his nerves fell backwards off his stool. Granny kicked the bush. Her boot went right through it. See, she said to the world in general in a strangely satisfied voice. Nothing's real, it's all just paint and sticks and paper at the back. May I assist you, good ladies? It was a rich and wonderful voice, with every diphthong gliding beautifully into place. It was a golden brown voice. If the creator of the multiverse had a voice, it was a voice such as this. It had a drawback. It was that it wasn't a voice you could use, for example, for ordering coal. Coal ordered by this voice would become diamonds. It apparently belonged to a large fat man who had been badly savaged by a moustache. Pink veins made a map of quite a large city on his cheeks, and his nose could have hidden successfully in a bowl of strawberries. He wore a ragged jerkin and holly tights with an aplomb that nearly convinced you that his velvet and ermine robes were in the wash just this moment. In one hand he held a towel, with which he had clearly been removing the makeup that still greased his features. "I know you," said Granny. "You done the murder." She looked sideways at Margaret, and admitted grudgingly, "Leastways, it looked like it." "So glad. It's always a pleasure to meet a true connoisseur. Alwyn Vittler, at your service. Manager of this band of vagabonds," said the man, and removing his moth-eaten hat, he treated her to a low bow. It was less an obeisance than an exercise in advanced topology. The hat swerved and jerked through a series of complex arcs, ending up at the end of an arm which was now pointing in the direction of the sky. One of his legs, meanwhile, had wandered off behind him. The rest of his body sagged politely until his head was level with Granny's knees. "Yes, well," said Granny. She felt that her clothes had grown a bit larger and much hotter. "I thought you was very good too," said Nanny Og. "The way you shouted all them words so graciously, I could tell you was a king." I hope we didn't upset things," said Margaret. "My dear lady," said Vittler, "could I begin to tell you how gratifying it is for a mere mummer to learn that his audience has been behind the mere shell of grease paint to the spirit beneath?" "I expect you could," said Granny. "I expect you could say anything, Mr. Vittler." He replaced his hat, and their eyes met in the long and calculating stare of one professional weighing up another. Vittler broke first, and tried to pretend he hadn't been competing. "And now," he said, "to what do I owe this visit from three such charming ladies?" In fact, he'd won. Granny's mouth fell open. She would not have described herself as anything much above handsome considering. Nanny, on the other hand, was as gummy as a baby, and had a face like a small dried raisin. The best you could say for Margaret was that she was decently plain and well scrubbed and as flat-chested as an ironing board with a couple of peas on it. Even if her head was too well stuffed with fancies, Granny could feel some sort of magic at work. But not the kind she was used to. It was Vittler's voice. By the mere prospect of articulation, it transformed everything it talked about. "Look at the two of them," she told herself, priming away like a couple of ninnies. Primping away like a couple of ninnies. Granny stopped her hand in the process of patting her own iron-hard bun, and cleared her throat meaningfully. "We'd like to talk to you, Mr. Vittler." She indicated the actors who were dismantling the set and staying well out of her way, and added in a conspiratory whisper, "Somewhere private." "Dear lady, but of a certain," he said. "Currently I have lodgings in yonder esteemed watering hole." The witches looked around. Eventually Margaret risked, "You mean the pub?" It was cold and draughty in the great hall of Luncra Castle, and the new chamberlain's bladder wasn't getting any younger. He stood and squirmed under the gaze of Lady Felmond. "Oh yes," he said, "we've got all them right, lots." "And people don't do anything about them?" said the Duchess. The chamberlain blinked. "I'm sorry," he said. "The people tolerate them?" "Oh, indeed," said the chamberlain happily. "It's considered good luck to have a witch living in your village. My word, yes." "Why?" The chamberlain hesitated. The last time he had resorted to a witch, it had been because certain rectal problems had turned the privy into a daily torture chamber, and the jar of ointment she had prepared had turned the world into a nicer place. They smooth out life's little humps and bumps, he said. Where I come from, we don't allow witches, said the Duchess sternly. And we don't propose to allow them here. You will furnish us with their addresses. Addresses, ladyship? Where they live? I trust your tax-gatherers know where to find them. Ah, said the Chamberlain miserably. The Duke leaned forward in his throne. I trust, he said, that they do pay taxes. Not exactly pay taxes, my lord, said the Chamberlain. There was silence. Finally the Duke prompted. Go on, man. Well, it's more that they don't pay, you see. We never felt that the old king didn't think, well, they just don't. The Duke laid a hand on his wife's arm. I see, he said coldly. Very well, you may go. The Chamberlain gave him a brief nod of relief and scuttled crabwise from the hall. Well, said the Duchess. Indeed. That was how your family used to run a kingdom, was it? You had a positive duty to kill your cousin. It was clearly in the interest of the species, said the Duchess. The weak don't deserve to survive. The Duke shivered. She would keep on reminding him. He didn't, on the whole, object to killing people, or at least ordering them to be killed, and then watching it happen. But killing a kinsman rather stuck in the throat, or, he recalled, the liver. Quite so, he managed. Of course, there would appear to be many witches, and it might be difficult to find the 3 that were on the moor. That doesn't matter. Of course not. Put matters in hand. Yes, my love. Matters in hand. He'd put matters in hand, all right. If he closed his eyes, he could see the body tumbling down the steps. Had there been a hiss of shocked breath down in the darkness of the hall? He'd been certain they were alone. Matters in hand. He tried to wash the blood off his hand. If he could wash the blood off, he told himself, it wouldn't have happened. He'd scrubbed and scrubbed till he screamed. Granny wasn't at home in public houses. She sat stiffly to attention behind her port and lemon, as if it were a shield against the lures of the world. Nanny Ogg, on the other hand, was enthusiastically downing her 3rd drink, and Granny thought sourly, was well along that path which would probably end with her usual dancing on the table, showing her petticoats and singing, "The hedgehog can never be buggered at all." The table was covered with copper coins. Vittler and his wife sat on the other end counting it. It was something of a race. Granny considered Miss Vittler as she snatched farthings from under her husband's fingers. She was an intelligent-looking woman who appeared to treat her husband much as a sheepdog treats a favourite lamb. The complexities of the marital relationship were known to Granny only from a distance, in the same way that an astronomer can view the surface of a remote alien world, but it had already occurred to her that a wife to Vittler would have to be a very special woman with bottomless reserves of patience and organizational ability and nimble fingers. "Mrs. Vittler," she said eventually, "may I make so bold as to ask if your union has been blessed with fruit?" The couple looked blank. "She means," Nanny Ogg began. "No, I see," said Mrs. Vittler quietly. "No, we had a little girl once." A small cloud hung over the table. For a second or two, Vittler looked merely human-sized and much older. He stared at the small pile of cash in front of him. "Only, you see, there is this child," said Granny, indicating the baby in Nanny Ogg's arms, "and he needs a home." The Vittlers stared. Then the man sighed. "It's no life for a child," he said. "Always moving, always a new town, and no room for schooling. They say that's very important these days." But his eyes didn't look away. Mrs. Vittler said, "Why does he need a home?" "He hasn't got one," said Granny. "At least, not one where he would be welcome." The silence continued. Then Mrs. Vitalis said, "And you, who asked this, you are by way of being his?" "Grandmother's," said Nanny Ogg promptly. Granny was slightly taken aback. It never would have occurred to her. Vittler played abstractly with the coins in front of him. His wife reached out across the table and touched his hand, and there was a moment of unspoken communion. Granny looked away. She has grown expert at reading faces, but there were times when she preferred not to. "Money is, alas, tight," Vittler began. "But it will stretch," said his wife firmly. "Yes, I think it will. We should be happy to take care of him." Granny nodded and fished in the deepest recesses of her cloak. At last she produced a small leather bag, which she tipped out onto the table. There was a lot of silver and even a few tiny gold coins. "This should take care of," she groped, "nappies and such like, clothes and things, whatever." 100 times over, I should think," said Vittler weakly. "Why didn't you mention this before?" "If I had to buy you, you wouldn't be worth the price." "But you don't know anything about us," said Mrs. Vittler. "We don't, do we?" said Granny calmly. "Naturally, we'd like to hear how he gets along. You could send us letters and such like, but it would not be a good idea to talk about all this after you've left. Do you see? For the sake of the child." Mrs. Vittler looked at the two old women. "There's something else, isn't there?" she said. "Something big behind all this." Granny hesitated, and then nodded. "But it would do us no good at all to know it." Another nod. Granny stood up as several actors came in, breaking the spell. Actors had a habit of filling all the space around them. "I have other things to see to," she said. "Please excuse me." "What's his name?" said Vittler. "Tom," said Granny, hardly hesitating. "John," said Nanny. The two witches exchanged glances. Granny won. "Tom John," she said firmly, and swept out. She met a breathless Margaret outside the door. "I found a box," she said. "It had all the crowns and things in, so I put it, like you said, right underneath everything." "Good," said Granny. "Our crown looked real tatty compared to the others. It just goes to show, doesn't it?" said Granny. "Did anyone see you?" "No, everyone was too busy, but—" Margaret hesitated and blushed. "Out with it, girl." "Just after that man came up and pinched my bottom." Margaret went a deep crimson and slapped her hand over her mouth. "Did he?" said Granny. "And then what? And then... Yes? He said... What did he say?" "He said, 'Hello, my lovely, what are you doing tonight?'" Granny ruminated on this for a while, and then she said, "Old Goody Whimper. She didn't get out and about much, did she?" "It was her leg, you know," said Margaret. "But she taught you all the midwifery and everything." "Oh, yes, that," said Margaret. "I'd done lots." "But," Granny hesitated, groping her way across unfamiliar territory. She never talked about what you might call the previous. "Sorry?" "You know," said Granny, with an edge of desperation in her voice. "Men and such." Margaret looked as if she was about to panic. "What about them?" Granny Weatherwax had done many unusual things in her time, and it took a lot to make her refuse a challenge. But this time she gave in. "I think," she said helplessly, "that it might be a good idea if you have a quiet word with Nanny Ogg one of these days. Fairly soon." There was a cackle of laughter from the window behind them, a chink of glasses, and a thin voice raised in song. "With a giraffe if you stand on a stool, but the hedgehog—" Granny stopped listening. "Only not just now," she added. The troop got underway a few hours before sunset, their 4 carts lurching off down the road that led towards the Stowe Plains and the big cities. Lancre had a town rule that all mummers, mountebanks, and the other potential criminals were outside the gates by sundown. It didn't offend anyone, really, because the town had no walls to speak of, and no one much minded if people nipped back in again after dark. It was the look of the thing that counted. The witches watched from Margaret's cottage, using Nanny Ogg's ancient green crystal ball. "It's about time you learned how to get sound on this thing," Granny muttered. She gave it a nudge, filling the image with ripples. "It was very strange," said Margaret. "In those carts, the things they had. Paper trees and all kinds of costumes, and—" she waved her hands. "There was this great big picture of fawn pots with all temples and things all rolled up. It was beautiful." Granny grunted. "I thought it was amazing the way all those people became kings and things, didn't you? It was like magic." "Margaret Garlick, what are you saying? It was just paint and paper. Anyone could see that." Margaret opened her mouth to speak, ran the ensuing argument through her head, and shut it again. "Where's Nanny?" she said. "She's laying out on the lawn," said Granny. She felt a bit poorly. And from outside came the sound of Nanny Ogg being poorly at the top of her voice. Margaret sighed. "You know," she said, "if we are his godmothers, we ought to have given him 3 gifts. It's traditional." "What are you talking about, girl?" "The 3 good witches are supposed to give the baby 3 gifts. You know, like good looks, wisdom, and happiness," Margaret pressed on defiantly. "That's how it used to be done in the old days." "Oh, you mean gingerbread cottages and all that," said Granny dismissively. "Spinning wheels and pumpkins and pricking your finger on rose thorns and similar. I can never be having with all that." She polished the ball reflectively. "Yes, but," Margaret said. Granny glanced up at her. That was Margaret for you. Head full of pumpkins, everyone's fairy godmother for 2 pins, but a good soul underneath it all, kind to small furry animals, the sort of person who worried about baby birds falling out of nests. "Look, if it makes you any happier," she muttered, surprised at herself. She waved her hands vaguely over the image of the departing carts. Was it to be wealth, beauty? "Well, money isn't everything, and if he takes after his father, he'll be handsome enough," Margaret said, suddenly serious. "Wisdom, do you think?" "That'd be something he'll have to learn for himself," said Granny. "Perfect eyesight, a good singing voice." From the lawn outside came Nanny Ogg's cracked but enthusiastic voice telling the night sky that a wizard's staff has a knob on the end. "Not important," said Granny loudly. "You've got to think headology, see? Not muck about with all this beauty and wealth business. That's not important." She turned back to the ball and gestured half-heartedly. "You better go and get Nanny then, seeing as there should be 3 of us." Nanny was helped up, eventually, and had to have things explained to her. Three gifts, eh?" she said. "Haven't done one of them things since I was a gel. Takes me back. What are you doing?" Margaret was bustling around the room, lighting candles. "Oh, we've got to create the right magical ambience," she explained. Granny shrugged but said nothing, even in the face of extreme provocation. All witches did their magic in their own way, and this was Margaret's house. "What are we going to give him then?" said Nanny. "We was just discussing it," said Granny. "I know what he'll want," said Nanny. She made a suggestion which was received in frozen silence. "I don't see what use that would be," said Margaret eventually. "Wouldn't it be rather uncomfortable?" "He'll thank us when he grows up, you mark my words," said Nanny. "My first husband, he always said, something a bit less physical is generally the style of things," interrupted Granny, staring at Nanny Ogg. "There's no need to go and spoil everything, Githa. Why do you always have to—" "Well, at least I can say that Nanny began. Both voices faded to a mutter. There was a long, edgy silence. "I think," said Margaret, with brittle brightness, "that perhaps it would be a good idea if we all go back to our little cottages and do it in our own way. You know, separately. It's been a long day, and we're all rather tired." "Good idea," said Granny firmly, and stood up. "Come, Nanny Og," she snapped. "It's been a long day, and we're all rather tired." Margaret heard them bickering as they wandered down the path. She sat rather sadly amidst the coloured candles, holding a small bottle of extremely thaumaturgical incense that she had ordered from a magical supplies emporium in faraway Ankh-Morpork. She had been rather looking forward to trying it. Sometimes she thought it would be nice if people could be a bit kinder. She stared at the ball. Well, she could make a start. "You will make friends easily," she whispered. It wasn't much, she knew, but it was something she'd never been able to get the hang of. Nanny Og, sitting alone in her kitchen, with her huge tomcat curled on her lap, poured herself a nightcap, and through the haze tried to remember the words of the verse 17 of the Hedgehog song. There was something about goats, she recalled, but the details eluded her. Time abraded her memory. She toasted the invisible presence. "A bloody good memory is what he ought to have," she said. "He'll always remember the words." And Granny Weatherwax, striding home alone through the midnight forest, wrapped her shawl around her and considered. It had been a long day and a trying. The theatre had been the worst part. All people pretending to be other people, things happening that weren't real, bits of the countryside you could put your foot through. Granny liked to know where she stood, but she wasn't certain she stood for that sort of thing. The world seemed to be changing all the time. It didn't used to change so much. It was bewildering. She walked quickly through the darkness with the frank stride of someone who was at least certain that the forest on this damp and windy night contained strange and terrible things, and she was it. "Let him be whoever he thinks he is," she said. "That's all anybody could hope for in this world." Like most people, witches are unfocused in time. The difference is that they dimly realize it and make use of it. They cherish the past because part of them is still living there, and they can see the shadows the future casts before it. Granny could feel the shape of the future, and it had knives in it. That will be all for tonight. Thank you for coming, for listening. And I hope that I could make the Terry Pratchett books all a little bit more fun for everybody who made the effort to come and listen. Anyway, good night, rest easy, be safe, be warm if it's winter like it is here. But for all my American listeners, keep yourself cooled down in the summer heat. Be kind to yourselves, be kind to your parents, be kind to your children if you are parents. And just generally, be good folk, would you? Sincerely, the Unwise Wizard.